what they're attempting to do. It's to make as much ground now whilst they still have those advantages in terms of numbers, material, and refurbished equipment, because they will have to do another bout potentially of mobilisation at the end of this year or next year. And there's no doubt that they have the people, but again, there's a Russian political cost to that. At some point, they will also have to start facing up to their own industrial capacity, which is switching from refurbishing old, albeit serviceable equipment, and begin increasing their manufacturing of new armoured vehicles, tanks, etc., to replace the losses that they're taking.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm James Hanson, and today we're talking about the latest on the war in Ukraine, and I'm delighted to be joined by Matthew Savill, Director of Military Sciences at the Royal United Services Institute. Matthew, always a pleasure. Welcome back to Frontline.
Thank you. Good afternoon.
First of all, can you give me your assessment of what we're seeing on the ground at the moment in Ukraine?
So a lot of this looks a bit like essentially what my colleague Jack Watling talked about fairly recently as the compounding advantages that Russia has, and that is it is still being able to use the larger number of people it's got on the front line and some of the advantages in firepower to very, very slowly grind its way forward. And that's mostly, it seems to be coming out of the Donbass and particularly the area around Donetsk. So the incursion in the north around Kharkiv, that looks like that has stalled and remained stalled for some time now. And indeed, the Ukrainians have sort of been able to push them back. And that hasn't created a buffer zone that the Russians wanted, and Russian artillery can't reach into the outskirts of Kharkiv. But because that was done at the cost of pulling reserves from elsewhere, we're seeing the Russians just being able to kind of very slowly move forward, or indeed, slightly worryingly for the Ukrainians, some of the recent reporting suggests they've picked up the pace of some of their territorial gains in the past couple of weeks.
Are we seeing any change in Russian tactics?
I mean, there's always a bit of a lag in terms of really understanding the detail of what's going on in tactics, and so much of it happens behind the scenes. Things like changing frequencies and the electronic warfare battle that goes on around the use of drones. But there doesn't seem to have been a radical change in Russian tactics. They're still taking horrendous casualties. There is a little bit of evidence of perhaps them being able to attack in slightly larger numbers, so at sort of battalion level, several hundred people at any one time. But they're still not conducting that kind of large coordinated offensive with thousands upon thousands of people attacking in coordinated fashion. But in truth, they don't need to make these kind of small incremental gains. What they are able to do is put pressure all the way along the front line and see where essentially the Ukrainians are thinnest. And that does seem to be, as I say, around Donetsk and a little bit also to the south around Zaporizhia.
As you say, they've been making small incremental gains on the front line. Some would say, given Ukraine's manpower issues and given the delay in Western military aid, it's surprising that Russia haven't been able to take more territory. What's your response to that?
So, first of all, for the majority of this phase of the war, so the past 2 years, it has turned out that defense is stronger than attack, and that's largely just because of the ability to see more of the battlefield, particularly as more and more surveillance drones and other capabilities have come into play, and to bring artillery to bear on prepared positions. So those kind of rapid thrusts that have taken place have actually been fairly unusual, and have largely taken place because of advantages temporarily in terms of either concentrations of forces or actually unfavourable conditions on the battlefield. So battlefield geometry, as it's called, essentially, where are people positioned? Have they got their supplies and logistics in place? Are there vulnerabilities? Are they slightly cut off? So no, the Russians haven't managed to make a huge breakthrough, but it does look like they are improving their position around some of the higher ground places like Savill, which are key to then being able to threaten further back and deeper into Ukrainian lines and pose them questions about whether or not they are prepared to cede some ground, essentially pull back, which is potentially militarily necessary but is politically difficult.
How big an issue is supplies for Ukraine currently?
So, I mean, it's difficult to know in terms of the sort of the day to day. The broad picture is that the Western support, particularly the big package of US aid, is now coming into play, and we've seen that in terms of various parts of the front line where there was a very unequal artillery battle going on. That the Ukrainians have been able to narrow that gap, but not necessarily close it. I think the big problem at the moment, whilst there are some issues around, for example, how quickly air defences can get into country, and we should probably return to the question of the air side of the campaign, their real challenge is their ability to increase their mobilisation and get people, through recruiting, into formed units and onto the front line. And that's not just a 2024 problem. Their issue is, can they mobilise, train, and put together in large groups the people that they will need if they really want to make any kind of large counteroffensive next year.
That's really interesting because earlier this year, President Zelensky did change the age of conscription to 25. It had been 27. Even despite that, mobilisation remains a massive issue for Ukraine.
I think there's some suggestion that there are challenges meeting their recruitment targets, but even where they do begin to meet those, it's simply a question of time. It takes time to get those people through the system, and there's a if you like, there's a compromise there. There's a trade-off, which is that they could put people through more rapidly and get them onto the front line sooner, and that would enable them to either thicken literally those lines or pull tired, exhausted units, many of whom have been in contact for months now, off those lines to give them a chance to re-equip and refit. But that means you're putting people with much lower levels of training into the fight. One of the things that had to be pointed out kind of repeatedly in terms of what the UK large-scale training program was doing, Operation Interflex. So that's the training activity that takes place here in the UK with a range of international partners, is that was always only ever initial basic infantry training. That wasn't intended to create fully formed forces that could operate at a large scale, coordinated with others. Those people still had to go on into then the Ukrainian training system and do specialist training or additional training. So you can only accelerate that kind of training so much before you're compromising on quality, which might mean you take more casualties when the Ukrainians have generally been much more careful about husbanding their resources in comparison with the Russians.
I mean, that's a really good point. It's a pretty stark disparity between how Ukraine approaches this and how Russia does. Russia clearly deciding it's about numbers, and a lot of the troops actually fighting on the front line have received very little training, it would appear.
Yes, and what if you had to infer from that, if you like, kind of slight recklessness, what they were attempting to do, it's to make as much ground now whilst they still have those advantages in terms of numbers, materiel, and refurbished equipment. Because they will have to do another bout potentially of mobilisation at the end of this year or next year. And there's no doubt that they have the people, but again, there's a Russian political cost to that. At some point, they will also have to start facing up to their own industrial capacity, which is switching from refurbishing old, albeit serviceable equipment, and begin increasing their manufacturing of new armoured vehicles, tanks, etc., to replace the losses that they're taking. What they've concentrated on up until now has been an awful lot of the air-launched weapons, sort of cruise missiles and precision strike weapons, because that is an area where they can really press home an advantage. But in due course, they're going to have to look at new artillery barrels, new artillery, both self-propelled and other types, and eventually new armoured vehicles.
Let's focus on the aerial situation in detail. It's worth saying we spoke earlier in the week on Frontline to your colleague Justin Bronk, who's a specialist in air power and technology. So go and check that video out if you want to find out a little bit more about the F-16s. But what we've known since speaking to Justin is that US officials have now confirmed that Ukraine has received its first delivery of F-16 fighter jets. What do you think the impact of them will be on the war, Matthew?
So I'm hoping I'm not going to wildly contradict what Justin said, but I think we've begun to see from Ukrainian officers some of what other analysts were saying, which is that these will be a useful complement to what is happening at the moment, but they're not going to be game changing because in the first instance, they're probably coming in relatively small numbers. The pilots will have gone through an accelerated training program, and that's not easy. So you don't want to essentially throw them in and throw them away early on. And the most immediate impact they can have is in an air-to-air role and essentially defensive. So in other words, trying to pick their targets amongst incoming drones and some of the slower-moving cruise missiles that they can effectively shoot down whilst remaining back from being too close to the front line. And that's partly because there are lots of quite capable Russian jets essentially around with long-range air-to-air missiles, but it's also because there's still quite a lot of Russian ground-based air defences that pose a fairly considerable threat to F-16s, particularly if they're operating in small numbers. And so the Ukrainians wouldn't want to have spent all of this time waiting for those capabilities to come in to throw them away. And there's probably not at this point a large air-to-ground role for their jets until they have really, first of all, worked out how to use them effectively, can protect them in their air bases so that the fleet isn't destroyed on the ground, but also have begun to degrade, if not essentially destroy, lots of those Russian ground-based air defences. A lot of that has been taking place around Crimea, for example. That's been done, by the look of it, with a lot of drones and other Ukrainian capabilities, because that's what's been opening the door to then attacking kind of larger, juicy targets like some of the ground-based radars, the Black Sea Fleet headquarters, and ammunition and headquarters areas in and around Crimea.
Yeah, you mentioned some of those strikes on Russian air defences in Crimea. Looking at it in the round, how would you assess Russia's air defences at the moment? Has it just been the case that Ukraine has been chipping away, but that Russia's air defences are still pretty strong, or are they a bit weaker than that?
Well, first of all, I think their performance overall has probably been not as good as we would have potentially expected. If you'd gone back a few years, you would have said there's quite a lot of older but still capable air defences, and they are certainly that. But what we've seen is the challenge of them having to be spread out over an incredibly long front line, and even when concentrated in and around Crimea. There is a way to get mass over those targets, as it's often been through drones, and the game of sort of decoys, electronic warfare, all of those things have come into play to enable striking the very large targets. One of the things that we don't know, and it's worth saying, is when these successful attacks take place, what we're often seeing is the last few drones or missiles that strike the target. We often don't know how many of them have been shot down or jammed getting there. So we always need to be a little bit cautious about saying effectively these systems are no good, but they haven't provided the level of protection that's been required. And now, because the Ukrainians continue to launch successful drone strikes over the border into Russia itself, the Russian military are facing challenges about where they place their remaining defences. So how many do they want to cover the south and Crimea? How many do they want along the border that's essentially around the eastern part of Ukraine? And how many can they spare to defend against those often very long-range, deep penetrating strikes that are being launched up towards Moscow and beyond? So we saw the probable loss earlier this week of yet another long-range bomber. I think it was another Tu-22. There's only a few of those, but we're talking Russian military air bases that are over 1,000 kilometers away and often further, where the Ukrainians are still able to get through to some degree. And that keeps posing the dilemma to the Russians about where to defend and with what.
And I suppose that underlines why President Zelensky is continuing to make this argument that the West should further loosen restrictions on where Ukraine can use Western supplied weapons inside Russia. There was a strike on a weapons warehouse, I think, in Kursk City, I think on Wednesday evening. So they're having some success, but if they were able to strike deeper into Russian territory and a wider range of targets, there would be real questions for Russia about where they place their air defences.
Yes, and some of this is about type of target. So it's worth noting that the focus has largely been on a combination of air-launched cruise missiles, largely provided by the UK and France and Italy. And those have a relatively speaking, I mean, they're standoff weapons, so they're designed to be fired by jets operating as far back as they can. But you're talking a couple of 100 kilometers in those cases. Some of these Ukrainian drones are going more than 1,000 kilometers. The focus of the weapons like Storm Shadow and Scout, and then the slightly longer range US ATACMS, which is essentially a ground launched ballistic missile, is that they can hit well protected, hardened targets, bunkers, or anything that's essentially behind a defensive screen. Of which there are a number that are just over the border or reasonably deep into Russia, but that essentially Ukrainian drones simply might not be able to penetrate against those targets, or you might need a cluster munition. So the ATACMS targets were if you could get a cluster variant that could scatter those munitions over some of the air bases that are in southern Russia. From which jets are launched, which, for example, are launching the glide bombs, or some of the attack helicopters. And some of those are just out of range of Storm Shadow, but they'd be just in range of ATACMS. Other targets are bunkers and arms supplies, which are hardened, and Ukrainian drones probably can't get at them. But a Storm Shadow would be great. So it's for those kind of sophisticated Western supplied weapons. It's less about the range, because they're much shorter actually than some of the very successful drone strikes. It's actually about a particular type of target that's sitting just over the border where those weapons would be beneficial.
And just returning to the F-16s, Ukraine says it would need around 130 F-16 fighter jets in order to neutralise Russian air dominance. Is it in any way realistic that at some point they could end up with that number?
I mean, that's genuinely difficult to know, because what we don't really know, although I imagine people are beginning to sort of do the maths, is how many F-16s of what variants are available or could be given up. There are probably that number out there that if countries were prepared to take the hit to their own inventories, that they could be mustered. But like so much of this is a little bit of a finger in the air. I mean, the question would be is, do they have longer range air-to-air missiles? One of the challenges that they've got at the moment. Do they have the latest or a more modern radar rather than, say, an older sort of mechanically scanned radar, which means that they're at greater risk of basically being detected by the Russian jets before they can detect them. And essentially the side that shoots first in air-to-air combat is often the one that comes out on top, which is why stealth is so great, because they don't get to see you. So I honestly couldn't put a figure on what would they need. They've clearly done some maths. Essentially any is useful. There would still be a question, though, of how to tackle those longer range Russian ground-based air defenses, which would be looking up at them. It's a very congested air environment, so there's lots of drones flying around at different altitudes, surveillance aircraft, Russian jets of different types. One of the challenges for the Ukrainians about moving into a more offensive role or an air-to-ground role is navigating that environment without, accidentally shooting down their own surveillance drones or being caught up in friendly fire incidents, because, of course, they would be operating over the top of Ukrainian ground-based air defences, who at the moment, when they look up, know that if they're looking at a jet, in most cases, it's probably a Russian jet. So as you add more complexity to the aerial battlefield, you add more questions about the use of your various weapons. And what you wouldn't want to do is start increasing the rate of friendly fire.
And of course, even if somehow Ukraine was able to get its hands on 130 F-16 fighter jets, doesn't get you around the issue of training and having the necessary fighter pilots who are fully trained.
No, and fast jet pilot training. I mean, the UK's got recent experience of essentially the pipeline of pilots slowing down, and it being quite hard to then kind of recover and speed it up. So to get hundreds of, well, let's say dozens of pilots through, you would be having that same challenge that we discussed earlier, which is where do you cut corners? Where are you prepared to take risk? The Ukrainians might be prepared because this is existential for them to take quite a lot of risk in training. But if you do that and you put those pilots in, then the challenge might be that you lose a lot of them early on.
Just finally, Matthew, what are the key things that you'll be looking out for on the ground in Ukraine over the next sort of few months or so?
So I think some of it is essentially whether the front line, which is not moving rapidly, but if it does grind to a halt, where does it grind to a halt? And what does that look like in terms of, as I said, the geography? Are the Russians able to take high ground, and are they able to therefore start bringing some of their artillery in range of Ukrainian weak points? That also matters because if you assume there's a Ukrainian counteroffensive coming next year, every mile that they lose now is another mile they've got to take back next year. Now, it might be advantageous to draw back to a better position, but they have to bank on facing a similar level of Russian defences as they did last year. And that was the big thing that our team have looked at in terms of research recently, which is that it proved that marrying up the equipment, the training, and the people just didn't happen in time to prepare them to be able to breach those really kind of thick defences. And they were only able to do so in very small numbers. So where that front line ends up, that's one of the first things. Secondly, will be the comparative mobilisation, recruitment and training capacities and performance of the two sides, because that's an area of current Russian advantage and an area where the Ukrainians really need to make progress. And then finally, there is this question of essentially the ability of the Ukrainians to improve their defences. So this is a kind of 2024 like winter question in the face of the Russian air campaign. Can they find an answer to the glide bombs? Either hitting them on the ground or somehow finding a way to ambush them in the air before they release those weapons? Can they inflict, therefore, serious damage on the Russian Air Force? What are the other weapons coming their way that will almost certainly be continue to target, in fact, Ukrainian critical infrastructure and civilian targets? Because if we think that this year has seen increased pressure on the Ukrainian government politically, and that kind of sign of war weariness, then the Russian aim over the winter will be to try and kind of essentially deal a heavy blow to Ukrainian morale and political stability by making it look like that any attempt to redraw the battlefield now will be at such great cost that they would be better off effectively suing for peace or at least entering into negotiations. And critical to that is the ability of, countering that is the ability of the Ukrainian government to basically keep the lights on, keep people warm through winter, keep them fed. And so unfortunately, the pretty cynical Russian ploy of continuing to target the civilian population, particularly over the winter, will be an ongoing feature.
Matthew, always great to get you on the programme. Thank you so much for joining us today on Frontline.
No problem.
Thank you for watching Frontline for Times Radio. For more on global security and the war in Ukraine, you can listen to Times Radio, take out a digital subscription to The Times, and click subscribe on our YouTube channel.